Hi everybody, this is Robin and welcome to the second part of my video series in which we're going to be covering more of the Sicilian variations. In the coming videos we're going to be looking at knight f3, d6, bishop to b5 check, very much in the spirit of the previous video series in which we covered all the lines after knight c6, bishop to b5. We said that this is mostly aimed against Sveshnikov players. Now when looking at d6, we're in different territory. We're playing against players who are most likely looking to play the Najdorf as black, in case we opt for the open Sicilian. So we have the Najdorf, or perhaps even the Dragon. Those are the two most popular lines right now. These lines are very complicated and require lots of knowledge, and therefore I also decided to tackle d6 with bishop b5 check in my most recent games. And right now the most topical line here is knight to d7. We're also going to be looking at the classical move bishop to d7, but arguably knight d7 is the most relevant and the most important, and I think this is especially what Najdorf players love to play as black. So in this variation, most recently I've tried to go for the move d4, which is traditionally one of the main lines, and after c takes d4, queen takes d4, white usually gives up the bishop pair in hope to get some sort of interesting version of the open Sicilian. But my biggest weapon has always been the move short castle. Now the other main move here is c3, which has also been tried. It is kind of similar to what I'm about to show you. White goes queen e2 here and tries to go for some sort of Spanish looking position. But it has some drawbacks compared to the line we'll be looking at. So short castle a6. And for a long time here people took on d7 and then went for d4 anyway, transposing back into the aforementioned line. However, in 2013 when Magnus Carlsen decided to play the move bishop to d3 against Fiedler, it became obvious that this move bishop d3, as strange as it might look at first sight, is a very serious option, and people started to research it quite heavily. Including myself, many other players followed suit, and it soon became sort of the main line of what is now the knight d7 complex. So a little bit of history to start off with. First of all, what's white's idea? We want to play c3, bishop to c2 and d4 in one go, and thereby we don't have to put the queen on e2 as we saw in one of the previous lines, and normally we go for rook e1. So what we're really aiming for is kind of to build up the center in a way we normally would see in a Ruy Lopez. So if you are familiar with the Ruy Lopez, you might be a little bit more comfortable with the material at hand. If not, don't be worried, the positions are not exactly similar, but I would make sure that you familiarize yourself a little bit with the ideas of that opening, either the Italian or the Ruy Lopez. So in that first game of Magnus Carlsen against Peter Svidler, Peter tried to play the move knight to e5, which was directly aimed against white's plan of playing c3, d4, as black basically says, I'm going to go knight e5 and try to prevent any central expansion at the cost of a double pawn. So in this variation, which later on was not really adopted anymore because it doesn't give black a very good position, Magnus played a4, bishop to e2 is another interesting move that might render some advantage, but a4 was fine, preventing expansion with b5 and already preparing ideas that are not entirely unfamiliar to us also from the Rosalimo. Here knight to f6, b3, and after bishop e6, which is aimed to play a little bit against his bishop on d3, taking on b3 is the threat. White actually does pretty good after bishop to b2, bishop takes b3. And in the game here, Magnus played queen to e2, and after c4 it got a little bit complicated. Instead, the move bishop to e2 seemed to give white a very good position. After the following moves, of course, the only real point for black is to take on e4, otherwise he's down in development and white's already looking to do some damage on that b file potentially. So knight takes e4 has to be played, but it turns out that after something like bishop f3, queen d5, and after this pawn sacrifice, it's probably black who is in a lot of trouble. He's still fully underdeveloped. The pawn on b7 is hanging. White has a pretty easy way of increasing the pressure. And so the first try for black in this variation kind of failed, and people had to start looking for new ways. Now, there's a lot of ground to cover here, so I've split up the material in two videos. But another move that we should be looking at here is the natural move g6. And we will see g6 in two versions. But this was a pretty interesting way by Wojtaszek that was tried in 2014 to improve on the previous idea we just saw. So white goes c3. Generally speaking, white wants to go c3, rook e1, bishop c2. But as we will see, there are some technical differences in the move orders. And after bishop g7, bishop c2, knight to e5. Basically, black has managed to wait for white to make these moves c3, bishop c2, thereby arguing that perhaps this is a slightly better version of what we saw before. Now, it doesn't really turn out to be that great for black either. Again, a4 seems to give white a pretty pleasant position. And the piece setup here is quite natural, I would say. After something like knight f6, knight c4, knight d7, d3, we're following the game Ma against Wei Yi, and from 2014. And after something like castle, bishop to e3, white will follow up with b4 as indicated by arrows. And I like white's position. Our bishop is a lot better than his bishop on g7, and potentially our other bishop can get back into the game with b3. And we have a pretty nice play on the queen side here. So this is by no means equal, and also this idea didn't really stand the test of time. So black had to start looking in different directions. Now, the most logical move here, and what should be considered the main line, is knight to f6. And here we already see the first quite important but not so obvious difference. White generally starts here with rook to e1. And of course, the natural move instead of rook e1 would be to go c3. The difference is that after c3, b5, we've limited our options somewhat as white, and as we'll see in the next videos, one of the main ideas of rook e1 is actually to play b5 c4, which can now pretty much be considered the main line. More of that in the next video, but it's important to realize that after something like c3, b5, a4 to challenge this pawn on b5, c4 is very quickly here the pawn on e4 is hanging. c4 becomes a very serious move, and after the following line, it turns out that black gets excellent counterplay. It goes something like a takes b5, a takes b5, taking on a8, queen takes a8, knight to a3, and here black turns out has more than enough compensation by just giving up the pawn on b5, and he has pressure against d3. Knight c5 is coming next. This is not very good for white. So there is another pretty concrete idea here that we have to be worried about as white, which is stopping us from carrying out our normal plan of c3 and d4. But rook e1, as I said, the idea is b5 c4, and more of that later because it leads to totally different positions. But rook e1 leaves us a little bit more flexible, and as I said earlier, rook e1 is generally the right square for the rook, so we don't have to be worried that we limited our options too much by that. Now here, once again, black has a lot of options. Let's go back to g6 for a second. What happens if black just plays g6, bishop g7, and lets us take the center? Well, we'll see a lot of these types of positions appear, and it's something you have to be pretty much happy with as white. We got the center. Obviously black has slightly better development in some way, but it's not by any means a center that is easy to play around. And this was an instructive game of Peter Svidler, which I think you should have a look at in the ebook. But as you can see, with the moves like h3 and a3, we are sort of solidifying our control. There's no b4 anymore. There's not an easy way for black to go d5 or e5. Both of them have their drawbacks. Most of the time e5 will be answered by d5, when we see that the bishop on b7 will be rather misplaced, and d5 usually by e5. So these types of positions we will look at some more, but it happens quite frequently in this variation that we get to kind of a standstill once we got the center covered, in which black wants to do something very active because he might be a little bit more developed, but can't really do so due to the lack of central control. A similar scenario happens after the move e6, which was actually covered by my friend and co-author of Chess24, Nicholas Huschenbeth, in his series on the anti-Sicilian. He thought that this was the best way for black to go about. It also is quite clever because black is waiting for white to go c3, so he doesn't have to bother about b5, c4 ideas at this point. And also here we reach a position which of course is slightly different. First of all, black doesn't have to take on d4, and he puts the bishop on e7, but the general tendencies are the same. Here I would think that the best way to play is knight d2 and knight f1, and we're moving in a very sort of Spanish sort of way. We're moving our knight to g3, and then we're trying to develop our pieces accordingly. So this was the game Hu Yifan against Vachier Lagrave, and I think that this is quite an instructive game because it shows how white can slowly but surely develop and then think about what to do next while still maintaining the control over the center. So in the game h3 was played, which is by no means a bad move. I just don't see the direct need for it right now because knight g4 is not really something I'm worried about. So I would take queen e2 here as a main line and as a small improvement over that game. And it's important to note that whenever black goes rook to c8, and we'll see this idea some more, we have to go bishop d3 virtually always, because the positional threat over here would be that if we, for example, develop our bishop, we can no longer take with the pawn because our bishop is hanging. So we got to take with the knight, and that leaves us in kind of an open Sicilian position where our pieces are not placed particularly well. So we always aim to keep the pawns in the center and have the options of breaking through with e5 or sometimes d5. And a position like this is kind of what I would aim for as white. This has been played several times by black, and I think it's one of the more decent ways to go about it. We'll probably see more games appearing in this type of variation. But to give you an example, if black goes knight b6 to get his knight a little bit more active, we try to prevent that by b3. And we don't have to be particularly worried of a move like c4 here, because we can go bishop c2, and once again there's no direct way for black to really attack us over here. And I think it's quite hard as black to come up with a move here, because once again e5 will be answered by d5, and those who are familiar with the Spanish will probably like this position for white. Specifically the bishop on b7 is just very misplaced, and yeah, white has a good position over here, and potentially even some attacking ideas on the king side in some cases. So if he goes, for example, knight d7, rook c1, a little detail is that if black wants to further improve his position by putting the bishop to g7, maybe in some cases we can really make use of the fact that we haven't played h3 yet, and we go for h4 in one go. And as you can see, there are some attacking ideas over here with h5, and if black decides to go h5, he does allow us to put the knight on g5, and potentially some sacrifices or h5 or even f4 in some cases could be an idea. So once again, this is the type of position I would like to go for. There are a couple more ways for black to play besides the main line of the next video, and one of them is the move e5, which is altogether quite different from the previous lines that black can go for. It really looks much more like a Spanish than ever before now. Kind of like a Breyer with knight b8, knight d7 being played. I suggested you just go c3 over here, and once again we see one of the white has to be a little bit clever over here. If black goes bishop to e7, once again we're dealing with an idea of playing c4 here, and of course it's virtually always the case that we don't want to get into a pawn structure like this. It's simply kind of against the principle of the line in which we try to really gain access to a good center with the pawns on d4 and e4. So normally we would have to go for something like knight a3 when queen c7 and b5 will come, let's say b3, b5, and this happens to be one of the versions where this actually works out quite well for black. So this is one of the few lines where you have to go bishop to f1 instead of bishop to c2. It's really the only exception that I sort of came across. And now we can go d4 anyway, and I honestly don't think it matters that much. Once again, it's important that you realize a couple of standard ideas over here, and otherwise I think this position is a little bit better for white, but does require some experience, so definitely go out and play this if you have the chance to. Bishop to b7, for example, always has to be answered with d5, once again highlighting the fact that the bishop is not very well placed on b7. If queen c7, I like the move a4, sort of provoking some action on the queen side, and if let's say b4 takes, now we already see that after d takes, and let's say knight d2, there are some squares available for our pieces, and it doesn't look that good for black. And if black castles, which is the most logical move, again this move a4 is something that I like to play as white, and after rook b8 takes knight a3, white was a bit better here in the game. Tomaszewski, Ponomariov, after knight b4, knight c4, a lot of pawns were exchanged, but it was white who still had the more active position. Black was virtually forced to go e takes d4 here, I think, because of the pressure on the e5 pawn. Note that even in these positions, by the way, with the bishop on b7, and even if there's no pawns on the queen side, this could be quite annoying because white can set up some pressure and try to play for the c6 square. So there's lots of play left here, and white's a bit better. And after e takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f5 and knight c6 were both already kind of threatened, so white was much better in this game. Once again, Tomaszewski, Ponomariov in the Chinese tournament in 2016. So coming back to the move e5, e5, c3, another way to play is b5, and here we come to kind of the last detail of this variation. a4 should be played. We want to have black play b4 when we can safely play bishop to c2, and now c4 ideas are significantly less easy to carry out as black because there is no longer the support of the pawn chain. So this type of position would lead us to kind of areas that we've already discussed. But c4 over here is quite an important one to cover. And here the move bishop f1 once again should be played. And after the following sequence of sharp moves, we get into very similar kind of positions as we saw in one of the other lines, except that our bishop is now on f1 rather than c2, one of the first lines that I showed in this video. And the detail, well, it's actually not a very hard detail to see. If we follow the same line as we did over there, when black sort of had time to play castle, and we said that with the bishop on c2 he has rook c8, knight c5 and lots of play on the light squares. Now of course the pawn on c4 will be hanging, so this is not no rocket science, this is just a very good version for white. And it turns out that in all of the lines here it's white who's better. There's a couple of tricks, like here knight d4 opening up the e-file, but in general this is not something black should go for. As we can see, we win the piece back over here, and it's better for white. So just to rehearse that line, this should serve as sort of an introduction to this variation. After knight f6, rook e1, we reach the critical position in this variation. Black has various alternatives at his disposal, but pretty much all of them that allow us to play c3, d4 lead us to positions which are fairly easy to play. So those lines do not differ too much when it comes to the type of position we want to go for. Normally knight d2, knight f1 is the standard maneuver, and then we put our knight at g3 and try to support our center. However, e5 is a bit different because our bishop does not go to c2 over here, but to f1 in most of the lines. So for example, bishop e7, bishop f1 was important to stop c4 ideas, and also b5, a4, c4, bishop f1. Turns out to be better for white because in some line later on the pawn on c4 can be hanging when the pawn on b5 falls. So this was quite a long introduction video to the knight d7 weapon, but it's necessary because this is probably the most likely line you're going to be facing. A little bit of history there, so let's rehearse that as well. Black initially tried to tackle this line by going knight to e5 in various ways. Immediately knight e5 here with the knight on f6 or playing g6 first and then going knight e5, but those positions turned out to be quite easy for white to play. Now there are some people who go for the line with e6, like Nicholas mentions in his video, but I do think that the positions arising here are pleasant for white and give us the type of play that we're looking for. And here the main idea is to go queen e2, bishop d3, bishop d2, and then sort of try to get an overview of what black is up to and restrict his pieces even more if you get the chance. And that leads us to the next video, in which we're gonna be looking at the move b5 over here for black, and more about that because b5 leads us to a totally different type of game. And I hope to see you back there. Thank you for watching.